last questioner for this panel will be Commissioner Ben-Veniste.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your testimony today, which I think is very useful to us in continuing to fill in the blanks and to provide the public with a definitive account to the best we can of what occurred in the lead up to and during the tragedy of 9/11. Let me ask Mr. Morris to focus on the question of information which was shared with you or not in the summer of 2001 before 9/11. We know that the threat level that was being received by U.S. intelligence agencies was at the highest they had ever received. And while there was a focus on the potential for an attack against American interests overseas, certain members of the intelligence community at CIA and at FBI had recognized that there was a potential that this horrendous attack, which was being much discussed in conversations which our intelligence community had intercepted, might in fact be directed against domestic targets. Beyond that, we knew that when Ramzi Youssef was rendered back to the United States, and indeed being flown back to the United States, he made a comment to those who were transporting him. Looking out the window of his airplane, he reportedly said in substance, "We will finish this job." Recognizing that there was this threat level of unprecedented proportion, and recognizing that New York was a obvious and potential target, and more particularly that the World Trade Center could be struck again, and given the fact that the FBI, John O'Neill, Barry Maughan, heading up the FBI's efforts on counterterrorism in the summer of 2001, were particularly concerned about events and reports that they had received that, for example, two Yemenis were taking photographs of federal buildings downtown, not far from the World Trade Center, and had been instructed to send those to an individual in Indianapolis who they later determined was using an assumed name, a false identity, and who disappeared immediately after these two Yemeni individuals were interrogated and has never been found. Can you tell us whether you received any information from the FBI or any other federal sources in advance of 9/11 that there was a potential that Lower Manhattan could be struck in this summer of threats?
The only first-hand information that I have was as the commanding officer of LaGuardia Airport that the FAA had put out a warning at the screening points.
And that was back in July.
Yes.
And that warning, as far as we've been able to determine, resulted in, as far as we can see, absolutely no change in any procedure that the FAA had employed. There was no hardening of cockpit doors. There was no enhanced screening at checkpoints. Individuals with 4-inch knives were able to board airplanes on September 11th. Individuals of the same descent and characteristic as was consistent with the individuals against whom we were supposedly protecting ourselves.
That's correct. As far as my knowledge, none of the regulations were made more restrictive on what you could take onto a plane.
And so my question is, as we wrestle with the issue of a balance between protecting information of a sensitive nature and the ability to protect against another terrorist threat, do you have a view as to whether the federal authorities have been overly restrictive in disseminating information on grounds of claimed protection of sensitive material?
Being a member of the Port Authority Police Department, who has had a history of events with terrorists going back to a bombing at LaGuardia left in a locker, the FBI has always been open to us. If they have information that has to pertain to one of our facilities, we've been told. Prior to '93, there was information that came out, and in fact, the perimeter of the Trade Center was increased prior to that. Again, after '93, we became a member and very active in the Joint Terrorist Task Force office out of New York with our detective, and we were filled in on information.
Are you now saying that you did have information during the summer of 2001 from federal authorities about the potential for this high alert status that we were on, resulting in an attack against the domestic United States?
It was just a very general, as far as I know, not specific of any plane coming in.
Well, obviously not, but with respect to what you were told, the sum and substance, as I understand it, had to do with this July FAA
Correct.
general warning.
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.